Forest mysteries. The cold came for Mitch long before the snow did. It started in his fingers each morning when he cracked the ice from the water bucket. Then it settled in his chest, a familiar weight he'd carried for 10 winters. By the time November had stripped the last leaves from the birches, the cold was simply who he was. He moved through the forest like a ghost, checking his trap line along the old creek bed. The first trap was empty. So was the second. He reset them anyway, his breath fogging in the weak afternoon light. The work was ritual now, muscle memory that let his mind drift somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want it to go. By the third trap, the wind shifted. Mitch paused, his gloved hands still on the trap's pan. He knew that smell, wet iron and heavy clouds. A change in pressure. He looked up through the bare branches. The sky had gone from pale gray to something bruised and low. Damn, he muttered. He moved faster, checking the remaining traps with practiced efficiency. The fourth held a marten, its sleek body already stiff. He reset the trap, bagged the catch, and kept moving. The wind picked up, whining through the pines. By the time he reached the old trapper's cabin, the first flakes were falling. He hadn't planned to stop here. The cabin was a mile from his usual route, a one-room shack with a collapsed porch and a door that never closed quite right. He'd used it for years before. After Sarah died, he'd avoided it. Too many mornings he'd sat on that porch waiting for her to come back from checking the east line. The morning she never came back. But the snow was coming hard now, and he was still an hour from home. He pushed the door open. The inside smelled of dust and mouse droppings and something else, something faint, animal but wrong. He froze, his hand going to the knife at his belt. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. The stove sat cold. The table was bare. The cot in the corner was empty. But the pile of old blankets near the woodpile was moving. Mitch took a slow step forward. A sound came from the blankets, a whimper, thin and raw, like a hurt animal. Then a snarl. He stopped. His heart was beating hard now, but not from fear. He'd heard that sound before, in the early years after Sarah died, when he'd found a trapped wolf pup, too weak to fight, but still trying. He knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Easy," he said, his voice low. "Easy now." He pulled the top blanket back. A child stared up at him. She was small, maybe 8, maybe younger. Her hair was matted with dirt and something dried that looked like blood. Her face was a mess of bruises, old and new. She wore a man's wool shirt torn at the shoulders, and her bare legs were scratched raw. Her eyes were wide, yellowed at the edges, and utterly wild. She snarled again, showing small teeth, and scrambled backward until she hit the wall. Mitch didn't move. He could hear his own breathing now, loud in the quiet cabin. Outside, the wind was building into a proper storm. "It's all right," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer. She couldn't, he realized, or wouldn't. Her eyes never left his face. Her whole body was trembling, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the tremor of something cornered and deciding whether to fight or die. He looked at her hands. One was pressed flat against the wall. The other was clutching something against her chest. He couldn't see what it was. "Okay," he said. He stood slowly, keeping his movements smooth. "I'm going to make a fire. Then we're going to get you warm. You understand?" She didn't move. He took a step toward the stove, and she pressed herself deeper into the corner. He gathered kindling from the box, his eyes never leaving her. His hands worked automatically. He'd built 1,000 fires in this cabin. The first with Sarah, her laughing at him for using too much paper. The last one alone, a week after they'd found her body, when he'd sat on this floor and thought about letting the flames take everything. He got the fire going. The orange light pushed back the shadows, and for a moment he could see her clearly. The bruises on her face were hand-shaped. He felt something cold move through his chest. "I'm Mitch," he said. "What's your name?" She stared at him, her grip on whatever she was holding tightened. He tried again. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me what happened?" Nothing. Just the sound of the fire and the wind outside. He looked at her hand again, the one pressed against her chest. The firelight caught something on her wrist, a leather cord worn smooth, and tied to it a brass button. He knew that button. He'd seen it 100 times on the uniform of a state ranger. His brother-in-law, Cal, had worn buttons just like that. The last time he'd seen Cal was at Sarah's funeral. Cal had tried to talk to him, said something about her accident not being right, about people covering things up. Mitch had told him to leave, told him to stop making her death worse with his conspiracies. He hadn't spoken to him since. The girl's eyes were locked on him now, and for a moment he saw something in them besides fear. Recognition? No, something else. The storm had them now. The snow was piling against the door, sealing them in. He pulled a blanket from the cot and sat on the floor near the fire, then retreated to the other side of the room. He sat with his back against the wall, watching her watch him. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question started to form, cold and sharp as the edge of his knife. How had a girl wearing a ranger's button ended up alone in a trapper's cabin, snarling like a wolf? And who had put those bruises on her face? He waited for morning, but he already knew he wasn't going to leave her. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like the cold, that taking her home would change everything. The storm lasted 2 days. By the time the sky cleared, Mitch had learned 3 things about the girl. She ate raw meat, she did not speak, and she would not let him touch her without drawing blood. He tried to carry her when she collapsed from exhaustion on the walk back to his cabin. Her teeth sank into his forearm hard enough to leave bruises beneath his coat. After that, he let her follow at her own pace, which was slower than he thought possible for something so small. She moved like an animal expecting to be kicked, flinching at every snapped twig, her eyes always searching the tree-line. His cabin sat at the edge of a frozen creek, a log structure he'd built with Sarah 15 years ago. The porch sagged where she'd wanted flower boxes. He never fixed it. He led the girl inside and closed the door behind them, and the sound of the latch clicking shut made her press herself against the wall. "It's just us," he said, keeping his voice even. "You're safe here." She stared at him with those yellowed eyes. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She was shaking, but he didn't think it was from the cold anymore. He started a fire and put water on to boil. While it heated, he took stock of what he had. Deer jerky in the cupboard, potatoes in the root cellar, a sack of flour. Enough for one man for 2 months. For 2 people, maybe half that. He'd have to stretch it. He set a bowl of broth in front of her, the meat shredded fine. She sniffed it, then pushed it away with a sound like a growl. He watched her eyes go to the slab of venison he'd left on the counter, raw, still flecked with frozen blood. "You want that?" She didn't answer. He cut a thin slice and placed it on the floor between them. She snatched it up with both hands and ate with her fingers, tearing at the meat, her teeth working quickly. When she finished, she looked at him again, and for a moment the wildness in her face softened into something that might have been gratitude or hunger. He couldn't tell. He gave her another slice, then sat across the room and let her eat in peace. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. He learned not to approach her from behind. He learned she would only drink water if he left the cup and walked away first. He learned that at night she slept curled in the corner of the main room, her eyes half open, ready to run. On the 4th day, she took cooked food for the first time. He made a stew. The meat boiled until it fell apart. She sniffed the bowl for a long time, watching him eat his own portion. Then she dipped her fingers in and tasted. He saw the confusion on her face, the unfamiliar warmth of it, before she drank the rest. He started calling her in. It came to him one morning when he heard a winter wren singing outside the window, a small bird that survived the worst months. "That's what I'm calling you," he said, pointing at the window. "Wren." She didn't respond. But the next day, when he said it again, her head turned. He tried to ask her questions, her name, where she came from, how she'd ended up in that cabin. Nothing. The words seemed to mean nothing to her. Or maybe they meant everything, and she couldn't shape them. On the sixth day, the men came. Mitch was splitting wood when he heard the snowmobiles. 3 of them coming up the logging road. He set down the axe and walked to the edge of his property, positioning himself between the machines and the cabin door. They stopped 20 yards out. For men, he recognized the driver of the lead machine, a thick-necked man named Croft who worked at the logging camp. The others were younger, harder, the kind of men who looked at you too long. "Mitch," Croft said, cutting the engine. "Heard you might have found something out in the woods." "Found a lot of things," Mitch said. "What are you looking for?" Croft swung off the machine, his boots crunching in the snow. "Girl, maybe 8, 9 years old. Lost out here. Her family's worried sick." Mitch kept his face still. "Lost how?" "Wandered off. You know how kids are." Croft's eyes moved past him, toward the cabin. "Mind if we take a look around? Make sure she didn't find her way here." "I mind." Croft smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come on now. We're just trying to help." I said no. The 3 younger men exchanged looks. One of them shifted his weight, and Mitch saw the butt of a pistol under his coat. The cold air felt suddenly thinner. Then a sound came from the cabin. Low, guttural, a growl that was not quite human. Croft's smile disappeared. He stared at the cabin, and Mitch saw something pass through his face. Not concern, but recognition. And satisfaction. "Well," Croft said slowly, "guess you found her after all." He didn't move toward the cabin. He stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. "You don't know what you got there, Mitch. That thing ain't a girl. Not anymore. Get off my land." Croft held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, climbed back on his snowmobile, and raised his voice so it carried to the cabin. "We'll be back. When the snow melts, we'll be back." The machines roared to life and disappeared down the road. Mitch stood there until the sound faded. Then he went inside. Wren was pressed into the far corner, her hands bloody. She'd scratched deep grooves into the floorboards, for long lines gouged into the pine. Her chest heaved, and her eyes were wide, fixed on the door. He knelt down, keeping his distance. "It's all right. They're gone." She didn't look at him. Her hands were shaking. He followed her gaze to the door again and understood. She wasn't afraid of being found. She was afraid of the men who had come looking. He looked at the brass button on her wrist. Ranger issue. The same button Cal had worn. The same button on the uniform of the man who had told him Sarah's death wasn't an accident. Croft said they'd be back. Mitch looked at the girl, at Wren, and thought about the winter ahead. The snow would keep them safe for now. But come spring, he'd have to make a choice he'd spent 10 years running from. He'd have to stop hiding. The snow came again 3 days later, and this time it didn't stop. Mitch stood at the window watching it fall, thick and heavy, the kind of snow that buried roads and erased boundaries. By noon, the logging road was gone. By evening, the drifts against the cabin wall reached the windowsill. He checked his supplies again. Enough flour for maybe 6 more weeks, venison for 8 if they stretched it, potatoes softening in the root cellar. He'd planned for one man. He hadn't planned for her. Wren spent those first days pressed against the wall near the stove, watching him with the same wary stillness she'd brought from the trapper's cabin. She ate when he ate, slept when he slept, but she never let her guard down completely. He'd find her in the middle of the night, sitting upright, her head cocked, listening to sounds he couldn't hear. On the fifth day of the storm, she moved to the table. He'd made bread, the last of the flour, he realized with a sinking feeling, and set a piece on the table near his chair. She crept closer than she'd ever come, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She wore a pair of his old socks, pulled up to her knees, and one of his wool shirts belted at the waist with rope. She looked smaller than he'd thought, her arms thin beneath the sleeves, her collarbone sharp against her skin. She reached for the bread, her fingers brushing the edge of the plate, and stopped. Her eyes flicked to him, waiting for permission, or waiting for him to take it away. "Go ahead," he said. She grabbed it and retreated to her corner, but she didn't eat right away. She held it, turning it over in her hands, her nose twitching as she smelled it. Then she took a bite, and he watched her chew slowly, her eyes closing for just a moment before she went back to watching him. The next morning, he found her standing at the window, her palm pressed flat against the glass. Snow had piled up outside, reaching halfway up the frame, and she was staring at it like she'd never seen anything like it. "It's just snow," he said. She didn't respond. He'd stopped expecting her to, but she stayed at the window for a long time, and when she finally turned away, her hand left a print on the cold glass. He started talking to her more after that, not expecting answers, just filling the silence that had been his only companion for 10 years. He told her about the trap line, about the winter he'd tracked a wounded buck for 3 days, about the cabin he and Sarah had built board by board. She listened, or at least she didn't leave the room when he talked, and sometimes she'd look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. On the 10th day after the storm started, the temperature dropped so low the trees began popping in the forest, the sap freezing inside them and splitting the bark with cracks like rifle shots. He woke in the dark to find Wren standing over his cot, her hand outstretched, her face pale in the light from the dying stove. "Cold," she said. The word came out rough, barely shaped, like a stone worn smooth by water. He stared at her, and she stared back, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Yeah," he said finally. "It's cold." He got up and added wood to the stove, and she followed him, staying close in a way she hadn't before. When he sat down, she sat across from him, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the fire. He found himself watching her the way he'd watch a deer in the forest, trying to understand without startling. She'd been someone's daughter once. She'd worn shoes and eaten at a table and slept in a bed. Somewhere along the way, that girl had turned into this creature, all sharp edges and animal wariness, and he found himself wondering what it would take to bring her back. The thought unsettled him. He'd spent 10 years becoming something less than human, hiding from the world, letting the forest swallow him whole. Now here he was, trying to pull someone else out of the same darkness. On the 12th day, the storm broke. The sun came up pale and thin, lighting the snow so bright it hurt to look at. Mitch went outside to dig out the woodpile and found the world buried up to his waist, the trees bent under their weight, the silence so complete it seemed to press against his ears. When he came back inside, Wren was at the table again. She'd found a piece of paper, an old feed catalog he'd used for kindling, and a stub of pencil. She was drawing something, her movements slow and deliberate, her tongue caught between her teeth. He set his coat by the stove and sat across from her. She slid the paper toward him without looking up. It was a house, a small house with a peaked roof and a door and 2 windows. Beside it, a figure with a ranger's hat. Beside that, a smaller figure with long hair. And on the wrist of the smaller figure, a circle drawn and redrawn until the paper wore thin. She pointed to the ranger. Her finger moved to the brass button on her own wrist. "Father," she said. The word was clearer than the first one had been. Mitch nodded slowly. "Your father. Gal." She didn't seem to recognize the name. She pointed to the smaller figure with long hair. "Manga." He looked at the drawing, then at her face. There was something there now that hadn't been there before, something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear. Recognition, maybe, the first stirring of memory. "What happened to them?" he asked, though he wasn't sure she could answer. She put her hand on the brass button. Then she pointed to the ranger figure and drew a line across its chest with her finger, the way she'd seen him clean his knife after skinning a catch. She looked up at him, her eyes flat and steady, and made a sound he hadn't heard from her before. A sound he recognized from his own throat 10 years ago when they'd told him about Sarah. It was the sound of grief. He sat with her in the quiet, the fire crackling, the snow pressing against the windows. And for the first time since Sarah died, he reached out and touched another person on purpose. He put his hand on the table, palm up, and waited. She looked at his hand for a long time. Then she put hers in his, small and cold, and held on. The weeks that followed were the quietest of Mitch's life, and somehow the loudest. Ren learned new words every day. She'd point at something, the stove, the window, his hands, and wait until he said the word, then repeat it back, her voice rough but steady. "Stove," she'd say, and then point again, as if testing him. He found himself talking more than he had in years, filling the cabin with words he'd stored up and never used. By mid-December, she could ask for food, water, fire. She still didn't say much about before, and he didn't push. Some things, he knew, came out on their own time or not at all. She slept on the cot now, the one he'd moved closer to the stove. He'd taken to sleeping in the chair, his rifle propped against the wall within reach. Not because he didn't trust her, because the men would be back when the snow melted, and he'd spent too many nights dreaming of snowmobiles and brass buttons to pretend otherwise. The dream came most often now, the same one he'd had for 10 years. Sarah walking the trap line, her coat red against the snow. Him finding her, his hands on her cold face. But lately the dream changed. Sarah's face became Cal's, and Cal's face became Ren's, and he'd wake with his heart hammering and his hand on the rifle before he remembered where he was. On the morning it happened, he was outside chopping ice from the creek when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A high whine, distant but distinct, carried on the wind from the south. He straightened up, the axe hanging at his side, and listened. Snowmobiles. He moved fast, leaving the axe in the snow and half running to the cabin. The wind was against him, carrying the sound away, but he knew what he'd heard. He pulled the door open and found Ren at the table, a piece of bread in her hands, her head already cocked toward the window. "Down," he said. "Now." She didn't argue. She slid off the chair and moved to the corner he'd shown her weeks ago, the one behind the woodpile, where she couldn't be seen from the door. He pulled the bolt on his rifle and went to the window, standing to the side where the light wouldn't catch him. The snowmobiles came up the logging road, 3 of them, moving slow through the deep snow. He counted 4 men again, the same shapes he'd seen before. Croft led them, his thick shoulders hunched against the cold, his machine leaving a plume of powder behind it. They stopped at the edge of his property, the same place they'd stopped before. Croft cut his engine and sat there for a long moment, his face turned toward the cabin. The others waited behind him, their machines idling, exhaust curling up in the still air. Mitch's finger rested against the trigger guard. He could put a round through Croft's engine block from here, send them all scrambling. But that was a line he wasn't ready to cross. Not yet. Croft raised his arm and pointed toward the cabin. He said something to the man behind him, something Mitch couldn't hear, and then he did something unexpected. He turned his machine around. They all did. They headed back down the road the way they'd come, the sound of their engines fading into the trees. Mitch stayed at the window for a long time after they were gone. Something was wrong. Croft hadn't come to talk. He'd come to look, to see if the cabin was still there, if the smoke was rising, if Mitch was still alive. He was waiting for something, the thaw maybe, or something else. He found Wren still pressed into the corner, her eyes fixed on the door, her breathing shallow and fast. She made a sound he hadn't heard before, a low vibration in her throat, almost like a growl but higher, thinner. He'd heard that sound from trapped animals sometimes, the ones who'd stopped fighting and started waiting. "They're gone," he said, keeping his voice low. She didn't move. He knelt down, putting himself at her level, and waited until her eyes found his. "They can't get in. The snow's too deep. They'll wait until spring, but we'll be ready." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something she'd never done before. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, her fingers curling into his sleeve like she was holding on to something that might float away. Her hand was shaking. "Bad," she said. He nodded. "Bad, but we're going to be okay." He didn't know if he believed it. He said it anyway, because she needed to hear it and because saying it out loud made it feel more true than it was. Later that afternoon, after the light had started to fade and the cold had settled back into the bones of the cabin, he went out to check the woodpile. The snow had drifted against the shed, and he was digging it out when he saw something that stopped him cold. The deer carcass lay at the edge of the clearing, half buried in the snow. It had been gutted, the meat stripped from the ribs, the head twisted at an angle that didn't happen in nature. He hadn't put it there. He hadn't shot a deer in weeks. He walked toward it slowly, his boots crunching in the crusted snow. The tracks around it were snowmobile tracks, already filled in but still visible, a circle of them where the machines had stopped. They'd brought it here, left it for him to find. He stood over the carcass, looking at the way the ribs had been cracked open, the way the eyes were frozen wide. It wasn't a gift. It was a message. They knew he was here. They knew what he had, and they were letting him know that they could come closer than he thought. He buried it in the woods, dragging it far enough from the cabin that the smell wouldn't draw wolves. By the time he came back, his hands were numb and his shoulders ached, and the cold had settled so deep in his chest he wasn't sure he'd ever get out. When he opened the cabin door, Wren was at the window, her breath fogging the glass. She'd drawn something in the frost, a stick figure in a hat, and another figure with an X across its chest. She pointed to the X, then to the tracks outside, the ones that led to where the deer had been. She looked at him, her face pale in the fading light, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear. It was certainty. She knew who had come. She knew what they wanted. And somewhere behind those yellowed eyes, she was waiting for him to understand. The supplies ran low in the third week of January. Mitch had known it was coming, had counted the cans, weighed the flour, stretched the venison until there was nothing left to stretch. He stood in the root cellar with a candle, looking at the empty shelves, and felt the cold settle into his bones in a way that had nothing to do with winter. The secondary cache was 2 miles north, buried under a rock shelf he'd used for years. He'd stocked it the autumn before Sarah died, and he'd added to it each fall since, a habit born from a life that taught him to always have something put away. But it had been 3 years since he'd last visited it. He didn't know what he'd find. He couldn't take Wren. The walk would be hard enough alone, breaking trail through snow that had drifted to his hips in places. And there was something else, something he didn't want to name. If Croft's men came back, he needed to know she was hidden where they wouldn't find her. The cellar door was the only place he could think of. It was small, dark, and cold, but it had a heavy bolt on the outside that would hold against anything short of an axe. He hated the idea before he even said it out loud. "I have to go," he told her that evening. They sat at the table, a single candle between them, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. "I need to get food. You'll stay here, in the cellar. I'll bolt it from the outside, and you'll be safe until I come back." She stared at him, and for a moment he saw something pass across her face that he couldn't read. Then she nodded once and looked away. He showed her the cellar the next morning. It was a hole in the ground, dirt walls, and a dirt floor, the air thick with the smell of potatoes gone soft and the cold that never left. A few jars of pickled vegetables sat on a shelf, and an old wool blanket hung on the wall. He put a candle down there, matches in a tin, and a jug of water. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "You wait here. Don't make any noise. Don't come out for anything." She stood in the middle of the cellar, her arms wrapped around herself, and looked up at the square of light from the trapdoor above. He saw her throat move as she swallowed. "Alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'll be back," he said again. He climbed out and closed the trapdoor. The bolt slid home with a sound like a gunshot. He stood there for a moment, his hand on the wood, and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd left Sarah that morning. She'd waved from the porch, and he'd gone to check the east line, and when he came back, she was gone. He'd spent 10 years telling himself it wasn't his fault. Standing here, with a child locked in his cellar, he knew it was a lie. He took the rifle and started walking. The forest was silent, the snow so deep it swallowed every sound. His legs burned with the effort of breaking trail, and the cold bit at his face until he couldn't feel his nose. He moved on instinct, following the landmarks he'd known since he was a boy. The split pine, the creek bend, the rock that looked like a bear's back. The cache was where he'd left it, a pile of stones at the base of a granite outcropping, half buried but still visible. He dug it out with his hands, the snow burning his skin through his gloves. The wooden box was still there, the lid frozen shut. He cracked it open with the butt of his knife and found cans, beans, tomatoes, peaches, wrapped in burlap to keep them from freezing, a bag of dried apples, a slab of salt pork wrapped in wax paper. He took it all, stuffing it into his pack until the straps bit into his shoulders. The walk back was harder. The wind had picked up, whipping the snow into his face, and the tracks he'd made were already filling in. He kept his head down and his feet moving, thinking about the cellar, about Wren alone in the dark, about the sound the bolt had made when it slid home. He reached the cabin as the sun was setting, the sky bleeding orange between the bare trees. He went straight to the cellar. The bolt was still in place. He slid it back and pulled the trapdoor open. "Wren," he called down. "I'm back." No answer. His heart stopped. He grabbed the candle from the shelf and lowered himself into the cellar, his boots hitting the dirt floor hard. The candlelight flickered across the walls, showing him the blanket, the water jug, the empty space where she'd been. She was in the corner, curled so tight she was almost invisible, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face pressed into her legs. She was shaking. "Hey," he said, crouching down. "Hey, I'm here. It's me." She didn't move. He reached out and touched her shoulder, and she flinched like he'd struck her. But then her head came up, and he saw her face, pale and streaked with tears she'd wiped away, and something in his chest loosened. "I came back," he said. "I told you I would." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she unfolded and pressed herself against him, her arms around his neck, her face buried in his coat. He held her, his hand on the back of her head, and felt her shaking slow to something steadier. When he helped her out of the cellar, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the shelf near the back, beside the jars of pickled vegetables, was a small hunting knife. Rusty, the handle wrapped in electrical tape, the blade nicked from use. He hadn't put it there. He'd never owned a knife like that. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was light, cheap, the kind of thing you'd buy at a hardware store and use until it broke. But it hadn't been here before he left, and Wren hadn't been alone. He looked up at the trapdoor, then at the ceiling of the cabin. Above the main room was a loft, a space he'd never used, where he kept old traps and broken gear. A space that had a door to the outside, a small hatch he'd never bothered to secure because no one ever came here. He went up the ladder slowly, the knife in his hand. The loft was dark, the air thick with dust. He lit a match and looked around. In the corner, someone had made a bed. A sleeping bag, an old tarp, a pile of blankets that smelled of sweat and wood smoke. Beside it, a pile of bones, rabbit, squirrel, gnawed clean. A can of beans, empty, the label faded. And a photograph tucked into a crack in the wall. He pulled it out and held it to the matchlight. It was a woman, dark hair, her face half turned from the camera. He didn't recognize her, but the handwriting on the back, faded but still legible, was his own. Sarah, October. Our cabin. The match burned his fingers. He dropped it and stood in the dark, the photograph pressed against his chest, and understood that someone had been living in his cabin. Someone who knew him. Someone who had left a knife in the cellar for Wren to find. He climbed down slowly. Wren was at the table, her hands flat on the wood, watching him. Her eyes were calm now, steadier than he'd ever seen them. "Someone else," she said. Her voice was soft, certain. "Before." He sat down across from her, the photograph face down on the table. The cabin was quiet, the fire dying in the stove, the dark pressing against the windows. He looked at the knife, at the cellar, at the girl who had been alone in the dark with a stranger's blade. And for the first time, he wondered what else he didn't know about the winter that was closing in around them. Mitch spent the next 3 days watching the forest. He checked the perimeter of the cabin each morning, circling through the trees, looking for tracks that didn't belong. He found nothing. The snow had filled in everything, smoothing the ground into a blank white sheet that stretched to the tree-line and beyond. But he knew someone had been there. The photograph of Sarah was still in his pocket, her face turned away from the camera, and the knife from the cellar sat on the shelf above the stove where he could see it. Wren watched him watch the forest. She started to talk more now, short sentences that came out rough and careful, like she was testing each word before she let it go. "Someone there," she said on the second morning, pointing toward the southern ridge. He followed her finger, but saw nothing. "How do you know?" She didn't answer. She just kept looking, her head cocked the way it had been in those first days, listening for sounds he couldn't hear. On the fourth day, he found the tracks. They came from the south, cutting across the ridge and down through the pines, heading straight for the cabin. One set of boots, the tread pattern worn smooth, the stride uneven. He followed them for half a mile before they disappeared into a thicket of hemlock. Someone had been within 100 yards of his door, watching, and then turned back. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the stove, the rifle across his knees, and listened to the cabin settle around him. Wren slept on the cot, her breathing slow and even, and he found himself watching the door the way he'd watched the forest when he was younger, waiting for something he couldn't name. He must have drifted off, because when he opened his eyes, the fire had burned down to coals and the light through the window was gray and thin. He was reaching for the rifle when he heard it, a sound outside, close to the door. A footstep, then another, then a long silence. He stood up slowly, the rifle in his hands, and moved to the window. A man was standing at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, thin, dressed in a parka that had been torn at the shoulder and mended with duct tape. His face was half hidden by a scarf wrapped around his mouth, but his eyes were visible, dark, deep set, fixed on the cabin. He didn't move toward the door. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his arms wrapped around his chest. Mitch pulled the door open and raised the rifle. "Don't move." The man raised his hands slowly, his fingers bare and red with cold. His scarf slipped, and Mitch saw his face, gaunt, the skin gray beneath a ragged beard, his lips cracked and bleeding. Frostbite had taken the tips of his ears, and his eyes had the glassy look of someone who had been in the cold too long. "Please," the man said. His voice was a whisper, barely audible across the clearing. "Please, I'm not one of them." Mitch kept the rifle up. "Who are you?" "Elias." The man swayed, his hands dropping to his knees. "I'm a biologist. I've been tracking the pack. The wolves. I didn't know." He stopped, his body shaking. "I didn't know you were here." Mitch watched him for a long moment. The man's hands were shaking, his whole body trembling with the cold. He was wearing boots that had been resoled with tire rubber, and one of the soles was flapping loose. He'd been walking for a long time. "Come inside," Mitch said. Elias took 3 steps toward the door and collapsed. Mitch dragged him across the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them. Wren was already out of the cot, pressed into the corner by the stove, her eyes wide and fixed on the stranger. Mitch ignored her for the moment, focusing on the man on his floor. Elias's hands were white with frostbite, the fingers stiff and curled. His cheeks were the same color, the skin waxy, the flesh underneath gone hard. Mitch built up the fire, put water on to boil, and started stripping off the man's coat. The smell that came off him was rank, sweat and wood smoke and something else, something like rot. "What were you doing out there?" Mitch asked as he worked. Elias's eyes were closed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "The wolves," he said again. "I've been following them for 3 years. The pack that lives in the northern valley. They're not normal." Mitch wrapped the man's hands in a wool blanket, careful not to rub the frozen skin. "What do you mean, not normal?" Elias opened his eyes. They were dark, bloodshot, but clear in a way that made Mitch's skin prickle. "They're too smart," he said. "Too organized. I've been watching them for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like it. They hunt like people. They communicate like people. And he stopped, his breath catching. "They what?" Elias turned his head, his eyes finding Wren in the corner. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but her face was different now. Alert, focused, her eyes locked on the man on the floor. "They protected her," Elias said. "The girl. They found her in the woods after her father died. They took her in, raised her, and when Croft's men came looking for her, the wolves drove them off. Killed 2 of them." Mitch's hands stopped moving. He looked at Wren, at the brass button on her wrist, at the way she was watching Elias with an intensity he'd never seen before. "You know about Croft," Mitch said. Elias nodded weakly. "I know everything. I know what they did to her father. I know what they've been doing in these woods for years. And I know why they want her back." He swallowed, his throat working. "She can identify them. She was there when they killed him. But that's not why they're hunting her." "Then why?" Elias looked at Wren again, and for a moment something passed across his face, fear or wonder or both. "Because the wolves came for her after. They came down from the valley, and they hunted Croft's men for 3 days. They almost got him, and now he thinks she called them. He thinks she can do it again." The cabin was silent. The fire crackled, the water boiled, and Mitch stood there with Elias's hands wrapped in a blanket, trying to understand what he'd just heard. He looked at Wren, at the girl who had snarled like an animal, who ate raw meat, who had known someone was in the forest before he did. "Is it true?" he asked her. "Did they come for you?" She stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and pointed toward the window, toward the northern valley where the wolves lived. "Pack," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "My pack." Elias's hands tightened under the blanket. "They're still there," he said. "I tracked them 3 days ago. They're waiting for something. And if Croft comes back, if he finds this place," he stopped, his breath catching. "She's not safe here. None of us are." Mitch looked at the rifle, at the door, at the girl in the corner who had once run with wolves. The fire was burning low, the light fading, and somewhere out in the forest, something was watching. Elias stayed for 3 days. He was stronger than he looked, the kind of thin that came from not eating enough, but still working, still moving, still surviving. Mitch gave him broth and bread, and by the second day, the gray had faded from his skin and his hands had started to pink up where the frostbite wasn't too deep. He'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand, the tips blackening at the knuckles, and he looked at them with a kind of distant acceptance that Mitch recognized. They talked in the evenings, after Wren had gone to sleep. Elias told him about the poaching operation Croft had been running for years. Illegal traps, protected species, a network of buyers who paid cash and asked no questions. He told him about Cal, Wren's father, who had been a ranger with a reputation for being stubborn and honest. Cal had found the operation. Cal had been found in the woods with a broken neck, and the report had called it a fall. "He was her brother," Elias said, nodding toward the cot where Wren slept. "Cal was Sarah's brother. You knew that?" Mitch nodded. He'd known it the moment he saw the brass button. He'd known it before that. Maybe in the way Wren's eyes looked when the light hit them just right, the same color as Sarah's had been. "She was there," Elias said, "when they killed him. She saw everything. Croft thought she'd die in the woods, that the winter would take her. But the wolves found her instead." On the 3rd day, Mitch was splitting wood when he heard the engines. He'd been waiting for the sound for weeks, had dreamed it so many times he almost didn't believe it when it came. But there it was, the high whine of snowmobiles coming up the logging road closer than they'd been before. He dropped the axe and ran for the cabin. Elias was at the window, his good hand pulling the curtain back. His face was pale. "They're coming," he said. 3 machines. I count 4 men. Maybe more." Mitch grabbed the rifle and checked the load. "Can you shoot?" Elias held up his left hand. The blackened fingers curled useless against his palm. "I can load. I can't aim." Mitch handed him the pistol from his belt. "Then you stay inside. Keep Wren down. If they get past me, you do what you have to." He went out the back door, circling around the cabin to the woodpile. The snow was deep here, the drifts up to his waist, but he knew the ground better than they did. He dropped to one knee behind a split logs and waited. The snowmobiles came into the clearing fast, their headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. Croft was in the lead, his machine roaring up to within 50 yards of the cabin before he cut the engine. The others fanned out behind him, 2 more machines for men total. They were armed. He could see the rifles slung across their backs, the pistol at Croft's hip. Croft climbed off his machine and stood there, his breath fogging in the cold air. He didn't call out. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, looking at the cabin, and then he raised his arm and pointed. The first shot came from a man on the left. It hit the woodshed, splintering the door, and then everything happened at once. Mitch fired. He didn't aim for the men, not yet. He put a round through the engine block of the nearest snowmobile, and the machine died with a cough of black smoke. The man who'd been standing beside it dove for cover behind a drift. Another shot came from the cabin, Elias firing blind through the window, the glass shattering outward. It went wide, but it made them duck. Croft shouted something Mitch couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. The 2 men on the remaining machines opened fire, bullets tearing into the cabin wall, splintering logs, punching through the window frames. Mitch heard Wren scream. a short, sharp sound that cut through the gunfire, and something in him went cold. He stood up and fired 3 rounds in quick succession. One took the headlight off the second snowmobile. Another ricocheted off the metal frame of the third. The third round hit a man in the shoulder, spinning him around, his rifle flying into the snow. Croft was moving now, running toward the cabin with his pistol drawn. He was fast for a big man, his boots finding the path Mitch had cleared to the woodpile. Mitch dropped back behind the logs and fired again, the bullet kicking up snow at Croft's feet. Croft didn't stop. He kept coming, firing as he ran, the bullets humming past Mitch's head. Then the cabin door flew open. Elias stood in the doorway, the pistol held in his good hand, his face a mask of blood from the glass that had cut him when the window shattered. He fired once, twice, 3 times. The first shot went wide. The second hit Croft in the leg, and he went down hard, his pistol spinning out his hand. The third shot was for the man behind him, the one who'd been trying to circle around the woodpile, and it caught him in the chest. The man fell. The other stopped. For a moment, the clearing was silent, the gunfire replaced by the hiss of melting snow and the ragged sound of men breathing. Mitch stood up, his rifle leveled at Croft, who was on his knees in the snow, his hands pressed against the wound in his thigh. The 2 remaining men were behind their machines, their rifles up, but they weren't firing. They were looking at Croft, waiting. "It's over," Mitch said. His voice was steady, louder than he expected. "You're done. Get off my land." Croft looked up at him, and even from 20 yards away, Mitch could see the hate in his eyes. "You don't know what you've done," he said. "That girl is mine. She's evidence. She's a child," Mitch said, "and you killed her father. You killed my wife's brother. And now you're going to leave, or I'm going to put the next one through your head." Croft stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a wet sound that turned into a cough. "The wolves," he said. "You think the wolves saved her? You think they're protecting her?" He shook his head, his face twisting. "They're waiting. They've been waiting. And when they come, she'll go with them. And you'll be alone again, just like before." Mitch pulled the trigger. The round hit the snow 6 inches from Croft's hand, and Croft flinched back, his laughter cutting off. The 2 men behind the machines were already moving, dragging their wounded companion onto one of the snowmobiles. Croft got to his feet, limping, his leg leaving a trail of blood in the snow. He climbed onto the remaining machine and looked back once, his face hard and cold. "This isn't over," he said, and then they were gone, the sound of the engines fading into the trees. Mitch stood there until the silence came back. Then he turned and walked to the cabin. Elias was on the floor, his back against the wall, the pistol in his lap. The blood on his face had dried to a dark crust, and his breathing was shallow, his chest barely moving. Mitch knelt beside him and saw the wound, a dark stain spreading across his ribs, a bullet hole he hadn't seen in the chaos. "You're hit," Mitch said. Elias nodded weakly. Didn't feel it until after. He looked at the pistol in his hands, then at Mitch. "Did they get her?" Mitch looked across the room. Wren was in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face white. She wasn't crying. She was just watching, her eyes wide and fixed on Elias's blood. "She's fine," Mitch said. "Good." Elias closed his eyes. "The tower. The old fire lookout, 50 miles north. Go there. They won't follow. Not after this." He opened his eyes again, and they were clear, focused. "She's not safe here. You're not safe here. Go north into the valley. The pack will find you." Mitch started to say something, but Elias shook his head. "No time. They'll be back with more men. You need to go. Now." Outside, the wind was picking up, blowing snow across the clearing, filling the tracks the snowmobiles had left. Mitch looked at Wren, then at Elias, then at the rifle in his hands. He knew he had minutes, maybe less, before the cold took Elias or the men came back or something else happened that he couldn't control. He heard it then, a sound that stopped his heart. A howl, long and low, coming from a northern valley. Then another, closer, and another. Wren's head came up. Her eyes went to the window, and for the first time since the shooting started, something moved in her face. Not fear, not anger, but recognition. She looked at Mitch, and her voice was steady. "Pack!" Mitch buried Elias before the light failed. There wasn't time for anything proper. No marker, no words, just a shallow grave behind the woodshed where the ground wasn't frozen solid. He wrapped the body in a blanket and covered it with stones and frozen dirt. And when he stood up, his hands were bleeding and his back was screaming, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed. Ren stood at the edge of the clearing, her face turned toward the north. The howling had stopped, but she was still listening, her head cocked, her whole body tense. When he walked up beside her, she didn't look at him. "We need to go," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, flat and hollow. Elias said the tower. "North. 50 miles." She nodded once. Then she pointed toward the trees, where the shadows were already deepening into dark. "They wait." He followed her finger, but saw nothing. Just the forest, the snow, the fading light. But he trusted her now in ways he hadn't trusted anyone in 10 years. They packed in the dark. He took the rifle, the ammunition, the last of the food, a blanket, matches, the knife from his cellar that he still didn't understand. He looked at the cabin as they left, at the smoke still rising from the stovepipe, at the sagging porch where Sarah had wanted flower boxes, and felt something tear loose in his chest. Ren led. He followed. She moved through the forest like she'd been born to it, her bare feet finding the frozen ground with a certainty he couldn't match. He'd put socks on her, boots he'd stuffed with rags, but she moved like she didn't need them, her steps light, her balance perfect. The snow was deep, the going slow, and within an hour his legs were burning and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. She never looked back to check on him. She didn't need to. The cold that night was the worst he'd ever felt. The temperature dropped so fast the trees cracked around them, the sound echoing through the dark like gunfire. He found a hollow under a fallen pine and pulled the blanket around them both, his back against the trunk, her small body pressed against his chest. She was warm, warmer than he expected, and she didn't shiver. She lay still, her eyes open, watching the dark between the trees. He must have slept, because when he opened his eyes again, the sky was gray, and the snow had stopped, and Ren was standing at the edge of their shelter, her hand outstretched. She was looking at something in the trees. He reached for the rifle and saw them. Wolves. 3 of them, standing at the edge of the clearing, their breath fogging in the cold air. They were gray, thick-coated, their eyes yellow in the pale light. The largest one, a male with a scarred muzzle, stood in front, his head low, his tail still. He was watching Ren with an intensity that made Mitch's hand tighten on the rifle. Ren took a step forward. Mitch grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said. She looked back at him, and for a moment he saw something in her face that wasn't the child he'd found in the trapper's cabin. It was older, deeper, something that had been in the woods long before he was born. "They know me," she said. "They won't hurt." She pulled her arm free and walked toward the wolves. Mitch watched with his finger on the trigger, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. She stopped 3 feet from the scarred male and knelt in the snow, her hands open at her sides. The wolf took a step forward, his nose working, and then he did something Mitch had never seen a wolf do. He sat down, his head lowering until it was level with hers. Ren reached out and touched his muzzle. The wolf closed his eyes. She stayed there for a long time, her hand on the wolf's face, the others waiting behind him. When she stood up, the wolf stood with her, and the three of them turned and walked back into the trees. She came back to Mitch with something in her hand, a tuft of gray fur, soft and thick. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "They will take us," she said, "to the tower. They know the way." He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that wolves don't lead people anywhere, that they hunt and kill and run from men. But he'd seen too much in the past months to argue anymore. He put the fur in his pocket and shouldered his pack. They followed the wolves north. The pack moved through the forest like a current, silent and steady, their tracks filling in behind them almost as fast as they were made. Mitch lost track of the days. He walked until his legs gave out, slept in hollows and under ledges, ate what the wolves didn't need. Twice he saw them hunt, a deer, a snowshoe hare, and watched Wren kneel beside the kill, her hands in the blood, her face calm. On the third day, the wind shifted. Wren stopped so suddenly he almost ran into her. She was looking back the way they'd come, her nostrils flaring, her body gone rigid. The wolves had stopped too, the scarred male lifting his head, a low growl building in his throat. "What is it?" Mitch asked. She didn't answer. She pointed, and he turned and saw them, three figures on the ridge behind them, half a mile back, moving through the trees. Men, with rifles. "Croft to come back." The scarred male let out a short bark, and the pack melted into the trees. Wren grabbed Mitch's hand and pulled him after them, her grip surprisingly strong. They ran. The forest blurred past, branches whipping his face, the snow sucking at his boots. He heard shouts behind them, and then a shot, the bullet snapping through the branches above his head. They ran until his lungs burned and his vision blurred, and he couldn't feel his legs anymore. When he stumbled, Wren pulled him up. When he fell, she stood over him, her face white, her eyes fixed on the ridge behind them. The scarred wolf appeared beside her, his muzzle wet, his sides heaving. He looked at Wren, and she looked back, and something passed between them that Mitch couldn't understand. "The tower," she said. "It's close. They'll find it. They'll find us." The wolf turned and ran, and the pack went with him, disappearing into the trees to the east. Wren watched them go, and for a moment her face was the face of the child he'd found in the cabin. Lost, alone, afraid. Then she turned and started walking again, and he followed. They found the tower at dusk. It rose out of the forest like a skeleton, steel legs planted in bare rock. The cab at the top a dark square against the fading sky. The ladder was still there, frozen but intact, and Mitch started climbing before he could think about what he was doing. Wren went up after him, her small hands finding the rungs, her feet sure. They climbed until the forest was a white carpet below them, until the wind was a constant roar in their ears, until the cab door swung open and they fell inside. He bolted the door behind them and stood at the window, looking down at the tree-line, at the shadows that were already spreading across the snow. Wren sat against the far wall, her knees drawn up, her eyes on the ladder below. She was waiting. So was he. The night came slow, the dark climbing up from the forest floor until it swallowed the trees, the clearing, the ladder beneath them. Mitch sat with his back against the cab wall, the rifle across his knees, watching the window that faced south. Wren was curled in the corner, her eyes half closed, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. Her breathing was too careful, too measured, like she was listening for something he couldn't hear. He didn't know how long they waited. An hour. 2. The wind picked up, rattling the metal walls, and the cold seeped through the gaps around the windows until his fingers were numb and his face felt like stone. He thought about the cabin, about the fire he'd left dying in the stove, about the photograph of Sarah still in his pocket. He thought about Cal, about the way his brother-in-law had stood at Sarah's grave with his hat in his hands, about the words he'd never said. The first shot came without warning. It hit the metal leg below them, the sound ringing through the tower like a bell. Mitch was on his feet before the echo faded, pulling Wren away from the window, pressing her into the corner where the steel was thickest. Another shot, higher this time, punching through the cab wall 6 inches from his head. He threw himself flat and crawled to the window, the rifle coming up. Below, 3 figures moved at the edge of the clearing. He could see their headlamps bobbing in the dark, hear their voices carried up on the wind. Croft was there, limping, his legs still bandaged from the wound Elias had given him. The other 2 were the same men from before, younger, harder, their rifles aimed at the tower. Mitch fired once, twice. The bullets kicked up snow at their feet, and they scattered, diving behind the boulders at the base of the tower. The shooting stopped, but he knew it wouldn't last. They had him pinned. He had maybe 20 rounds left, no food, no water, and nowhere to go. Wren touched his arm. He looked at her, and she pointed down through the grating in the cab floor. He could see the ladder, the top rungs just below them, and the dark shape of a man climbing. He aimed and fired, and the man fell, his shouts swallowed by the wind. But another was already climbing, and another. Croft's voice came up, shouting orders, and the shots started again. Bullets tearing through the cab, splintering the wooden floor, filling the air with dust and the smell of lead. Mitch fired until the rifle clicked empty. He dropped it and pulled the pistol from his belt, the one Elias had used. 2 rounds left. He looked at Wren, at her face pale in the dim light. And for a moment he was back at the cabin, standing on the porch, watching Sarah walk in the trees for the last time. He'd told himself he couldn't have saved her. He knew now that he'd been wrong. "Stay here," he said, "no matter what." He moved to the trapdoor, the pistol in his hand, and looked down. Croft was halfway up the ladder, his face turned up toward the cab, his eyes bright with something that might have been rage or fear or both. He was climbing slowly, one hand on the rungs, the other holding a pistol of his own. Mitch aimed. Croft saw him and fired first. The bullet hit the steel beside Mitch's head, the ricochet singing past his ear. He fired back, the shot going wide, and then the pistol was empty and Croft was still climbing. He heard the sound then, a sound he'd heard once before in the clearing after the firefight. A howl, long and low, rising up from the forest below, then another and another, until the night was filled with them, a chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Croft stopped climbing. He looked down, and Mitch saw his face change, the anger draining away into something else. Below them, at the base of the tower, the shadows were moving. Yellow eyes in the dark. The wolves had come back. Croft's men were shouting now, their voices high and scared. A shot rang out, then another, but the howling didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, and Mitch saw the wolves circling the tower, their bodies low, their teeth white in the darkness. Croft started to climb down. He moved fast, his injured legs slowing him, his pistol forgotten. He was 3 rungs from the ground when one of the wolves lunged. Croft jerked back, lost his grip, and fell the rest of the way, his body hitting the snow with a sound that made Mitch turn away. He lay there, not moving, and the wolves closed in around him. They didn't attack. They sat in a circle, their breath fogging in the cold, their eyes fixed on the man in the snow, waiting. Croft's men were gone. Mitch could hear them running, their shouts fading into the trees, the sound of their engines starting somewhere in the dark. He stood at the window, the empty pistol in his hand, and watched the wolves circle the tower until the sun came up. Wren came to stand beside him. She looked down at the wolves, at Croft's body, at the snow that was already covering his tracks. Her face was calm, empty of the fear he'd seen there before. She reached up and untied the leather cord from her wrist, the brass button slipping into her palm. She held it for a moment, turning it over, and then she opened her fingers and let it fall. They watched it drop, spinning end over end, until it disappeared into the snow below. The largest wolf, the scarred male, walked over and sniffed at the place where it had fallen. Then he looked up at the tower, at Wren, and his tail moved once, twice. Wren pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. "Home," she said. The helicopter came 3 days later. Mitch heard it before he saw it. The thrum of blades cutting through the cold air, and he was standing at the window with Wren beside him when it broke through the clouds and settled into the clearing below. The rotors kicked up a storm of snow, and he watched 2 men in dark jackets climb out, their heads down against the wind. They found Croft's body first. The snow had covered most of it, just a hand and a shoulder showing where the wolves had left him. The larger man knelt beside it, then stood and looked up at the tower, shielding his eyes against the glare. Mitch climbed down with Wren on his back, her arms locked around his neck, her face buried in his coat. The ladder was slick with ice, and his hands were numb by the time his feet touched the ground. The 2 men walked toward him, their faces unreadable. "You Mitch Cole?" the bigger one asked. He nodded. "State police. We got a call from a logging crew, said there was trouble out here. You mind telling us what happened?" Mitch set Wren down and kept his hand on her shoulder. "Man named Croft. He was running a poaching operation. He killed a state ranger 10 years ago, and he's been hunting this girl ever since. She saw it happen." The policeman looked at Wren, at her face still half hidden behind Mitch's leg. His partner was already walking toward Croft's body, his radio crackling. "That ranger," the man said. "Do you have a name?" "Kalunte." Something moved in the policeman's face. Recognition. There was a report. Years back. They never found enough to charge anyone. "You'll find it now," Mitch said. "There's a cabin south of here. A biologist named Elias was there. He had evidence. Notes, photographs. He died protecting her." The policeman looked at the tower, at the blood on the snow, at the girl with the wild eyes and the too thin face. He nodded slowly, and Mitch saw something in him that might have been understanding. "We'll need you both to come in. Make statements. Get her looked at." Mitch looked down at Wren. She was staring at the forest, at the tree-line where the wolves had disappeared. He knelt beside her and turned her face toward his. "We have to go with them," he said. "It's safe now. You understand." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. He stood up and took her hand, and they walked toward the helicopter. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Mitch's life. They took Wren to a hospital in the city, a place with white walls and soft lights, and people who asked questions she couldn't answer. She screamed when they tried to take her blood, bit a nurse when they tried to put her in a bed, and spent the first 3 nights curled on the floor with her back to the wall, her eyes fixed on the door. Mitch stayed with her. He slept in a chair by the window, left only when they made him, and talked to her in the same low voice he'd used in the cabin. He told her about the forest, about the spring melt, about the birds that would come back when the cold was over. He told her about Sarah, about the cabin, about the life he'd left behind. The social worker came on the 4th day. Her name was Diane, and she had gray hair and soft hands and a way of sitting that didn't crowd the room. She talked to Mitch first, asked him questions about how he'd found Wren, about the months they'd spent together, about what he wanted for her now. "She needs a home," he said. "A real one. Somewhere safe." Diane looked at him for a long moment. "She needs someone who understands her. Someone she trusts. She paused. That's you, Mr. Cole. He shook his head. I'm not. He stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. You saved her life, Diane said. You fought for her. You gave her words back. That's more than anyone else has done. He looked through the window into the room where Rin sat on the floor, her knees drawn up, her eyes on the window. She was watching a bird on the ledge, a sparrow that had found a crack in the glass and was trying to get in. I'm not her father, he said. Diane stood up. No, but you're the closest thing she has. Spring came slow that year. By the time the snow melted and the roads opened, the state had finished its investigation. Croft's operation unraveled quickly after they searched his camp. Traps, pelts, records that went back years. The men who'd worked for him made deals to save themselves, and by the time the ice broke on the rivers, the case was closed. They offered Wren a place in the city, a foster home with people who knew how to help children like her. Mitch drove her to the meeting, sat beside her in the waiting room, watched her stare at the posters on the walls and the toys on the floor and the other children who looked at her like she was something they'd never seen. When a social worker came to take her back, Wren grabbed his hand and didn't let go. No, she said. Her voice was clear now, stronger than it had been in the cabin. No. Diane looked at Mitch, and he looked at Wren, and he understood what she was asking. The cabin was still there when they went back. The roof had held through the winter, the windows were intact, and the porch still sagged where Sarah had wanted flower boxes. Mitch stood in the clearing with Wren beside him and looked at the place he'd spent 10 years hiding. It's not much, he said. Wren walked to the door and pushed it open. She stood in the doorway, looking at the stove, the table, the corner where she'd slept. Then she turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. Home, she said. He rebuilt the porch that summer, added a room, put in a real window, planted flowers in boxes where Sarah had wanted them. Wren learned to read, then to write, her letters slow and careful, her hands still clumsy with a pencil. She went to school in the fall, a one-room building 10 miles down the logging road, and came home with stories about other children in books and a teacher who said she was smart. In the evenings, they walked the edge of the forest together. Wren would stop sometimes, her head cocked, listening to sounds he couldn't hear. Sometimes at the edge of the clearing, there would be tracks in the soft ground, wolf tracks, fresh, circling the cabin in the dark. One night in October, a year after he'd found her, she stopped at the tree line and looked back at him. The moon was rising behind her, lighting the edges of the clouds, and the forest was quiet in that way it gets before the first snow. She put her fingers to her lips and whistled, a sound high and clear, and waited. A long moment passed, then another. He was about to speak when he saw them. Two shapes at the edge of the trees, gray against the dark, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. The scarred male stood in front, his head up, his ears forward. Behind him, a younger wolf, smaller, her coat still dark with summer. Wren looked at them, and they looked at her. Then she turned and took his hand, and they walked back to the cabin together. Behind them, the wolves melted into the trees, silent as smoke, and the forest settled into the long quiet of winter.